I'm Allan Walker, and both sides of my family came from Killin, but I didn't live in the village all my life. I sort of came and went. My father was working down in Glasgow, and when the war started, I was evacuated up to Killin, and stayed with Mary Hunter's mother and father at one time, and got to know the village then. And of course I had uncles here and aunts. My father's family came from Grey Street, and so I very much felt I belonged in the village. In fact, I've never felt I belonged anywhere else.
Has your family been here? How many years have they been here?
Well, about 1832, I think the Walkers arrived round about that time, and William Walker, he was the first postmaster in Killin, and the other side of the family were the Camerons, who in fact lived in this cottage, and he was the saddler. He came here about in the middle 1800s, died in 1915, aged about 96, I think. And he worked right through until he was a pretty old man. He was certainly 90 before he stopped work. And as I say, he was a saddler in this house here. But so as I say, I've got sort of connections and roots in the village itself, and I've never ever felt that I belonged anywhere else.
And what organisations are you involved in the village?
Involved in the Heritage Society, the West Loch Tay Salmon Fishers. I'm the secretary for that. And I'm also involved in carpet bowls and green bowls, and I sort of play not terribly well for both sides, as it were, when they have their matches against each other. Sometimes I play for the carpet bowlers and sometimes for the green bowlers. So I get accused of being a traitor by both sides.
Tell us about the Heritage Society.
That started, I can't remember how many years ago, but a fair number of years ago. There was a group of people in the village who were interested in not losing the heritage, not losing the stories and the traditions of the village. And initially, it was split into a number of different groups, interest groups. You know, one would be folklore, and one would be physical features. You know, the sort of geography of the area or whatever. You know, and I think it's now. I don't think these groups are now running separately, but they all did a bit of beavering away on their own particular areas. That's David Marden, who of course is the Warden, National Trust, head ranger. He was in right at the beginning and took a lot of responsibility in chairing it and so on. Dr. McCall, of course, Mary. Jim Sutherland, who is a tremendous interest in all things Gaelic and anything to do with history. Jim is interested. It's quite a thriving society, although we could do with some younger people coming in. And it's a pity more local people didn't join.
What does the society do?
Well, it brings speakers in throughout the winter, some very interesting speakers. And last year we had walks to various places of interest. John Sinclair led them. And you know, the last one I remember going to was the whooping cough stone, which had been lost for a while, but you know, it was reputed to cure whooping cough in the old days. And it's a basin, a natural basin in a rock off the Jonig Road, and it's now got a little plaque, and the society did that, and it's fenced off so that it doesn't get lost again.
Tell us about Morlanich.
Morlanich, that's a cottage up Glenlochy where the Robertson family, who were small farmers, had it. It's been preserved, It lay empty for many years, and the National Trust took it over and refurbished it. And I think there were about 16 or 17 layers of wallpaper on the walls. And the Robertsons themselves were sort of small farmers and horse breeders. And I remember one old boy telling me he'd seen the finest horse he'd ever seen was at Merlanich. Then I had another, Allan Walker, who was born at Corricharmig, further up Glenlochy. I asked her, farming stock, and I said to Ella, what were the Robertsons like, Ella? And she said, rascals. She said they were rascals. She would be from the kind of more polite side of the farming community, the more Uncle Gid, maybe. But Ella was very good. She was a marvellous person for Gaelic. She was a natural Gaelic speaker, a native Gaelic speaker. And I think she would be the last native Gaelic speaker, I think. And she learned Gaelic in Glenlyon and then at Corricharmig. And her father married a McNaughton from Duncross, the farm just across the road in Glenlochy.
Is there a history? When did people stop speaking Gaelic in the village?
Well, there were a number of people when I was a child who still spoke Gaelic. Funnily enough, this room, one time there was a wee sweetie shop here, and there's a little lady ran it who'd been from the Free. She'd been a member of the United Free Church, but she taught the Sunday school. I know I'm rambling a bit about it, but she's an interesting old lady. She had this little sweetie shop, and she was called Miss Robson, and she spoke Gaelic, and it was almost like a tuck shop, but she sold paraffin, she sold sweets, of course, and little tin toys, just sort of before the war and during the war, you get little toys made of pressed metal. I think they were made in Japan and Germany, I think. And I remember that quite well. And there's a little bell that used to tinkle when you came through the door. And she was very kind of religious in an old-fashioned way, being a free church person. And she taught the Sunday school in the white church, but I don't think she would go into the main building. She would teach the Sunday school at the side, But she told me, I can remember, remember things like that. She told me that it was sinful to whistle on a Sunday. And I can remember this, sort of quite clearly. And another thing she told me about was about a carter who'd sworn at his horse on a Sunday, and a great thunderbolt had come out of the sky and gone through, killed the man, you see, and made a hole in the cart. And of course I was horrified as a kid. I was terrified with this. I didn't whistle on a Sunday.
Was there much influence like that in the village, a free church influence?
Not that I remember. I think the church is reunited, you see, and where the school is now, the modern school, that's where the church was, and I think it was built by public subscription, and I think a lot of the congregation moved over at the disruption, and then not everybody went back. I know the Walkers never went back, and remained sort of resolutely, not belonging to the church at all. And although my great-grandfather, who was here, Alexander Cameron, the saddler, he was an elder in the Presbyterian church. Of course, I don't remember him because he died, as I say, in 1915. But you were asking about Gaelic. There were people. There was a big woman, McGregor, who lived across the road. I think in Cameron's buildings, but I'm not sure. You forget. But I remember hearing her speak Gaelic with Janet Robson, who, as I said, kept the wee shop. And there was an old boy where the post office is now. There's a house there called Edra, or I think it was Edra Cottage, and Dochie McPherson, and he was had been a carter, and one remembers he wore dark clothes, sort of dark serge trousers and a kind of wee dark serge waistcoat and a flat bonnet, you know. And he used to speak Gaelic, you know, to, I forget, it's Mrs. McGregor, but I can see her yet. She's a big soul, big woman. And the other interesting thing I found was that there were some men from Donegal working on the roads, and wee Dochie could speak to them. So the Donegal Gaelic and the Perthshire Gaelic must have had similarities. I thought that was interesting. And the Gaelic was taught, certainly, not taught, but Gaelic was spoken up until about 1907. I have a book in the house, school reports and so on. And the school inspector said that the children in Glenlochley were greatly handicapped because in coming to the village school they spoke only Gaelic. Now, that was 1907. So this area was pretty much a Gaelic speaking area.
And did they also wear kilts?
I shouldn't think so.
Kilts were not worn?
No, not after after they were forbidden and so on. The soldiers would, of course. But no, it wasn't a sort of kilted area. It would be at one time, before the 45.
How does village life now vary from when you first knew it?
It's a lot noisier, much more traffic. And again, it was snapshots I had of village life, you know, coming and going to Glasgow, coming up on holidays, meeting my uncles and so forth, and they were, I think they were far more interrelated at that time. You know, everybody knew everybody, and families were interrelated, and it was I think a closer community. But you know, that may be romantic nonsense in my head. You know, looking it back, and as I say, having relatives in Killin, and I may be looking at it through rose-coloured spectacles, but certainly it seemed to me to be a closer community. And although the population, I don't think the population has altered greatly. You know, it used to be about 600 or 700, something like that. I don't think it's altered a lot. But certainly, you know, it's moved from an old. For example, the train used to arrive, and you know, that was very much part of the village, and the excursions used to come in, and that was tremendous fun too. And all the people pouring off and looking for, you know, something to eat and so forth. And some people staying for bed and breakfast.
Was there not a story once about 2 trains coming in at the same time?
I think it was 3.
Tell us
3 excursions.
Once 3 trains came in.
Yes, it was when Norman Ingalls was working at the station. I think he was working as a porter at the time, and I was talking to Norman about this, and I said, anything interesting happened while you were working there? And he said, oh yes, he said once had trains back down as far as the pier, which is of course the other little station down at the lochside. He said, because 3 excursions came in at the same time through some oversight. And he said, of course, there was only one little cafe in the village at that time, and I think the Tralee Tea Room, which was where just across the road there. And I think there was another little cafe up the road. So there'd be 2 small cafes, and he said there'd be about 600 people sort of came off these excursions looking for food, you see. And he said they weren't very pleased about it. And I said, well, what happened, Norman? He said to me, he says, the station master locked himself in his room. And I said, what did you do? And Norman said, oh, well, he said, nowadays you'd call it maintaining a low profile. And I said, what did you do? He said, I could have hid in the toilets. Oh yeah, Norman, I've got Norman on tape telling me that story. I taped him because I thought it was, you know, interesting.
But tell us about the Killin News.
That's been in the go about.
Now what has? What's been
The Killin News has been in the go for about 10 years now, 6, 7, 8 years. I'm hopeless in that, but it was after, we're on our 50th, 52nd, as many as that, 57. We started with just 4 pages, of what I would call foolscap size. And it was after Sinclair, Aiken and myself I was living down at Queensferry and travelling home at weekends, you see, and I had a flat in Queensferry. And we picked up a local news and in Queensferry, and it looked as though it had been printed in toilet paper, and we were looking at it, and I said to Sinclair, God, we could do better than that, And then Sinclair was sitting, he talked about it and thought about it until his son said, never mind sitting there talking about it, do something about it. And so we did, and we got underway with it. And Sinclair edited it. And I did the running about, and Judy and a number of us were all on it at that time, and got it off the ground. We had our first meeting, our inaugural meeting in Shutters. We all sat round there and discussed what we would call it. And we thought that the Killin Free Press, but that was stymied. It sounded too political. And there's a guy at that time called Allan Friday. He was a lichenologist. We used to call him Alan the Lichen, you see. And he went and sort of prevented us in a way, calling it the Killin Free Press. But it has been free, of course, ever since, from the monetary sense, or in the monetary sense.
Do you think things like the organisations going and the Killin News, do you think they are important to the village?
I think so, yes. I think it gives a kind of cohesion. It had to happen, I think. With so many interest groups and so many organisations in the village, so many events happening, and I think it was time for a newspaper of some sort. I know some people sort of say, "Oh, it's a waste of time," and so on, and say things like, "Is it that rag again?" and things, which always irritates me a wee bit, because I feel like saying, "Well, why don't you get off your bums and write something yourselves?"
What do you think the main problems for Killin are?
Work for the young people.
I
think the main problem for Killin is work for younger folk. It's a shame to see young folk having to leave the village to find work. There's a need for, there was for a time, it was advocated that we should have sort of small workshops and so on. So somebody says starting a wee business, joinery or welding or anything, should have a place where they can keep material and work. And so I would think that's one of the main difficulties. The other thing is of course the loss of housing for young people. I know some houses have been built, subsidised housing just lately, but I believe one of them is already a holiday house. It's not a local person that's gone into it, and I believe so. So that I think this is a pity that a lot of the housing stock is gone, and the more holiday houses there are, I think that's a kind of an attrition for a village. I think that begins to sap the vitality of a village. It's all right that the folk in the holiday houses may be buying food here and so on, but I think it's a kind of bloodletting in a way.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the village?
I'm quite optimistic about it. Yeah, I think it's. I think it's got a future. I think it needs to be careful about some things. If it goes over the board, I mean, tourism is a sort of sacred cow, and it's important, but it's a double-edged sword, if I can use that. Mix my metaphors. But, I think if you're too dependent on tourism, and then tourism begins to wither, it's been a bad year this year, and the bed and breakfast side and so on. I think it's too chancy in many ways, and yet of course it is the primary industry, I would think. But I would hate to see Killin become like Callander. And this is me being opinionated. I think Callander is the absolute pits, you see. It's just ghastly. It's a kind of mini Blackpool. And I would hate to see Killin go too much that way. You know, folk come to Killin for a certain amount of peace and quiet. And because Killin, some people have said to me, well, Killin's in a time warp, but I think that does attract people as well. I would hate it to become too brash. But I think it's got a future, yes.
Good.
Farming isn't what it was at one time. I would hate to see that be lost, you know. The Highland Games, I think, has attracted and does attract a lot of valuable cash to the village, if you like. Trek from one place to another. When you've seen them once, it's very interesting to see such huge blokes, you know. And the next time you see them, well, you've seen it the year before, but for visitors who've never seen it before, I would think it's very interesting. But I think it's a good thing. It's amazing.
What do you attribute that to? What's the response of the village to all these?
It's very good, and I think there's a group of folk in the village who work very hard and sort of behind the scenes and organise. I'm amazed myself how many fundraising things there are, and you know, the little sales. I can remember they used to do it for the preschool playgroup and so on. And I'm amazed at the enthusiasm and the amount of money. I'd love to count up what the total that they've raised over the last 10 years, say, because it must be pretty, for a wee village, tremendous. And that's, I think there's certain sort of doers in the village who get up and get these things done. I just have to take my hat off to them.
What do you like best about the village?
Living here. Yeah. I like the people. That's what I like best, the people. I feel kind of, I always feel the village, and this may be a romantic nonsense, I feel they're kind of like a big family, and that we're all kind of part of the family, and there is a sense of community which I hope wouldn't get lost, you know. I hope won't get lost over the years if it gets very big and so forth. That's what I think about it, but that's just my feeling about it.
Yes.
About that. The thing is, things spark it off.
Yes, that's right.
You'll suddenly remember something, and it's like remembering about the Donegal men talking to wee Doki, you know.
Yes.
And then lots of stories I can remember lots of stories that my uncle Bill, who lived here, told me. He was a good historian. And my uncle Gib Walker, who lived in Greystone, I was always kind of slightly frightened of Gib, you know. He kind of, when I was wee, kind of sparks came out of his eyes if he was cross. But they knew an awful lot about the village, and they told me the names of the different hills and what they meant, and the burns and so on. And that, I wish I'd listened more.
No, you don't write it down. You don't.
Yeah, you forget. Yeah, these are the sort of things that one ought to write down. Again, if you're talking to people, you'll suddenly remember a story about, you know, where the American restaurant is now. I was told that there was an old inn there, and an inn before that, which is a Victorian, the station houses, I think they're called, aren't they? And there was an inn there, and that corner was where the Battle of Waterloo was. They announced the result of the Battle of Waterloo from that place, and the innkeeper was called Para Stocking, which Peter the Stocking, because he used to knit stockings and so on. Now, why that should come back to me, I don't know, but these things that people just told me, and I stored that up, thinking that's interesting, you know. May not be, but I found it interesting as a kid.
Any ghosts in Killin?
No, I don't think so. Other than the lady that I remember, there's a girl in Killin who runs a guest house in Vertay, you know, Gillian, and she rang me up one day and says, "Is there any story about a ghost in the railroad round about Finlarrig, you see?" And I said, "I don't think so. I've heard of ghosts at the Coily up Glenlochy," I said, I suppose if any place is haunted, Finlarrig should be, you know. But no, I haven't heard. I said, "Well, guests at the hotel have seen people, have seen this figure of a woman on the railway, and then she just vanishes, you see." And the guests had told them about this. So Gillian rang me, and I didn't think anything about it until I was toddling along there one day with the dog, you see. I saw this figure coming towards me and kind of looked down to see what the dog was doing. And I looked again and the figure had disappeared, you see. I thought, that's a bit weird, you know. And then a couple of weeks later, I saw this figure again, and the same thing happened, you know, around about the Red Bridge. She just suddenly disappeared. And it wasn't until it was a pouring wet night and this figure suddenly came trundling into view, and it was this girl. I think they call her Penny, and she lives below Beryl McLean. It was Penny sort of jogging, you see. And I said, "You're the ghost, you see." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You keep disappearing on this railway." She's frightened of dogs. And she saw a dog, and anyway with a dog, Penny was off the railway line. And that's what it was. I'm sure that solved it. So there you go. That's the only ghost story I know.